Well, welcome back. This is session number 5. We are going to be wrapping up the LDS in this session and hopefully moving on to our next Christian counterfeit. So we're currently in the topic of views on salvation. So essentially, right, taking us back to what they believe about Jesus, that his work was not fulfilled, our salvation was not completely fulfilled by the work of Jesus. So good works, this is a list of some of those. You have that list. You can read it further if you would like. There is a further type of individual salvation that you need to know about, and that is called exaltation. Can you tell me on your notes if you have all of the subtext in here?
We do.
They'll live eternally in the presence of the Heavenly Father. You have all of that? Okay. So I'm not going to read all of that to you just to try to help make up some time. But essentially what you need to know is that there is salvation in a broad sense, but you can further your salvation to exaltation. Okay? Remember what we said about God. How did God start? As a man. And he was able to exalt himself to become a God, right? Or Father God, or Elohim, right? So this is what we're talking about when we say, how do you do that, right? So you're going beyond just your average Joe salvation, if you will, and now you're moving into another level known as exaltation. So exaltation is eternal life, the kind of life God lives. He lives in great glory. He is perfect. He possesses all knowledge and wisdom, etc. This can happen. This level of salvation is achieved through. Do you have the list of all the things, ways you can achieve it? Accepting the gospel and all its covenants. Do you have that?
No.
Okay, let me read this to you really quick then, if you don't have that. The level of salvation is achieved through accepting the gospel and all its covenants, taking upon the obligations which the Lord has offered, walk in the light and the understanding of the truth. Just so you guys know, don't feel like you have to write all of these down because my notes will be released to you at the end of this session so you can look at them. Live by every word that proceedeth forth from the mouth of God. This is from Doctrines of Salvation, chapter 2, verse 43. Be baptized. Receive the laying on of hands to be a confirmed member of the Church of Jesus Christ and to receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. Must receive the Melchizedek priesthood and magnify their callings in the priesthood, receive the temple endowment, and be married for eternity either in this life or the next. Those who are exalted will receive special blessings. They will live eternally in the presence of Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. This is from D&C 7662. They will become gods. D&C 132, verses 20 through 23. They will be united eternally with their righteous family members and will be able to have eternal increase. Okay. They will receive a fullness of joy. They will have everything that Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ have. All power, all glory, dominion, and knowledge. D&C 132, 19 through 20. Through this type of salvation, human beings grow to become gods. So, if you wanted to know how, that is how, my friends. Views on death. Let's keep going. You can read from page 299 if you have, I want to say the 6th edition of your textbook. Let's see. I want to make sure I have that right reference and that I have the right book because I got a new one. Just give me 1 second to confirm that. I should have done that ahead of time. The page numbers are different and like stats and things like that are different and updated. Okay, so I'll read this to you really quick. This is on page 299 in the 6th edition. It says, this is under Mormon eschatology is the subheading. It says, Mormons also believe in the bodily resurrection of all men and in salvation in a threefold heaven. In Mormon theology, there are 3 heavens, the telestial, the terrestrial, and the celestial. McConkie states that, quote, most adults will go to the telestial kingdom and that it is composed of the, quote, endless hosts of people of all ages who have lived after the manner of the world. who have been carnal, sensual, and devilish, who have chosen the vain philosophies of the world rather than accept the testimony of Jesus, who have been liars and thieves, sorcerers and adulterers, blasphemers and murderers. This is from Mormon Doctrine, the year 1966, page 778. The second kingdom, known as the terrestrial, will be inhabited by Christians who did not accept the Mormon message, Mormons who did not live up to their church's requirements, and men of goodwill of other religions who rejected the revelations of the Latter-day Saints. This is from Mormon Doctrine, 1966, page 784. The highest or celestial heaven itself is divided into 3 further levels. Only in this highest level is godhood, or the possession of a kingdom for one's self and one's family, to be gained. This particular estate has its prerequisite, the candidates having been sealed by celestial marriage in a Mormon temple while upon the earth. Even in the celestial kingdom, godhood is by slow progression, and in the end, each who becomes a god will, with his family, rule and populate a separate planet of his own. So, remember when I jokingly said lots of heavens and maybe a planet? That's not for everyone, okay? You have to have done all the things and reached the highest level, and it is a progression. So you'll note what that is saying is essentially people like us, me and you, we get to go to the second level automatically.
Yeah, we're second tier.
So we'll never be able to reach the highest, and we'll never be able to become God.
What about those that apostates and murderers? Is that yet another level?
That's the
lowest.
The first level, I believe.
Yeah.
Or hold on, I think.
So I'm gonna be
Let's
lumped
see.
in there with all those
Let's
apostates and
see. The lowest, rejected the gospel, liars, adulterers. Aha. So here, I'm sorry, I knew there was a different thing. They go to outer darkness, apostates and murderers. Go to, quote, outer darkness. This says, a small number of individuals who commit the unpardonable sin will not receive a kingdom of glory, but will be banished to outer darkness with Satan, where they will be known as sons of perdition.
You know, I've seen Dr. Walter Martin in person lots.
Oh, yeah?
I Googled his book, The Maze of Mormonism,
Okay.
the other day, and right under that in Google was a book review from Brigham Young University refuting.
Of course there was. Of course there was.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting, for sure. So I'm just, because I just read that to you, I want to, like I said, you guys will get my notes, so you'll be able to see all of this to try to make up some time. I'm not going to touch every single piece, but I did want to say a few things. So we know that after death, the spirit of every man, what happens? You're all going to rise from the dead. They believe that. There is going to be a judgment. That's what I wanted to say. There's going to be a judgment. So a first resurrection will take place when Christ comes again. All the righteous will be resurrected. Then the final resurrection will take place after the millennium ends, and the spirit world will no longer be needed. I'm skipping over a bunch of these, so let me get my clicks straight here, guys. There we go. So, people will be judged according to their works and will be able to enter into one of the 3 kingdoms. And the 3 kingdoms were in the section that I just read from the book. So I'm not going to go into that in more detail, but they are here. There are different requirements that you have to reach to get into the different levels. And there is no shifting levels, so to speak. So if you are risen, your time has come, you don't get to shift levels in the afterlife, so to speak. So you're stuck, you're stuck. You are what you are at the time of judgment. So there is no advancing to higher kingdoms, right? So if you died and you ended up celestial, that's where you are for forever. Terrestrial, that's where you are for forever. And if you happened to do celestial, you barely made it by the skin of your teeth, right? That's for forever. And then, of course, there's outer darkness.
Where they can pray you out of judgment into their paradise or something like that.
They do baptism for the dead, eternal marriage, and sealing covenants for the dead. Is that what you're talking about?
Or something like that.
So baptisms for the dead are not performed for children who died under the age of 8 years old. But if they're 8 or older, the idea there being that they couldn't really have sinned that bad if they're not under 8, if they're under 8. But after that, they have like a stronger will and they can choose to do bad things and they would need atonement. I don't want to say bought and paid for, but essentially. So let's see if I can see. Everyone has a chance to hear and accept the gospel after death. The gospel is preached in the spirit world to deceased persons who have not yet been resurrected. If the saving ordinances have been done for them on earth by proxy, then they can choose whether or not to accept them. So I think this is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The necessity of making covenants and receiving ordinances in the flesh is the reason Mormons practice baptism for the dead, eternal marriage, and sealing covenants for the dead in their temples. But you have to be over 8. They don't do it for under 8. So, yes, it's if you haven't been resurrected yet. But once you're resurrected, it's no moves.
I think that's the reason they keep track of genealogies, so you can pray for your relatives going back.
That would matter, yeah. If the resurrection hasn't happened yet, that would certainly matter. Absolutely. And then apostates and murderers go to outer darkness. Those are the big deals. Other beliefs and practices. Let's look at that. I just talked about some of them already. So secret temple endowment rituals, celestial marriage, available only to members of the church who are in good standing, baptism on behalf of the dead, word of wisdom. Have you heard of this? The word of wisdom? Anybody? So it's what prohibits tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine drinks. I know a lot of current LDS do drink caffeine because a new word of wisdom came. And it allowed for certain leniencies, but the original word of wisdom prohibits tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine. They are believers in tithing, and a 2-year mission is encouraged. And so if you ever hear somebody was like, oh yeah, I was on mission to, I don't know, a foreign nation, they usually go abroad, and they say it that way, I was on mission, that's an indicator that you're talking to someone of the LDS faith. We do missions trips. We have missionaries as well, people who live abroad and spread the good news of Jesus Christ. It's not a foreign concept, but theirs is pretty structured, and that it's a 2-year program that's encouraged, especially in colleges, for college-aged students to complete their 2-year mission either while they're in college or just shortly thereafter. So yep, that's a big deal. And then they tithe as well. So they are tithers, which super successful people bring lots of money into the church, right? Door-to-door proselytizing. They have an extensive social network, and important to note, whoop, I went too far. People of African ancestry were denied full access to Mormon priesthood and privileges until 1978. Which is interesting to me because, like you alluded to, I think while we were on break, referencing Native Americans as kind of part of their original Jesus coming to the Americas and witnessing to the Native Americans as part of what they believe, and they're kind of descending from that as in some sort of way, is interesting because they certainly, Native Americans, would not have looked like white Anglo-Saxon people, but yet African Americans were automatically out. 1978 was not that long ago. So I always think that that's interesting. So it was a religion for the white man that didn't start that way, which again is interesting. And I say that with as little as I can. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a cult within a cult, my friends. How many of you have heard of the FLDS? Heard of the LDS, but have you heard of the FLDS? This is the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints.
Oh, yes.
They're a group which believes that God did not intend for polygamy to end once restored, and that they continue to practice it today.
Those guys, there was a guy that was on the news that had like a bunch of wives, and they were trying to like convict him.
Oh,
he
they
went
did.
to jail for a bit.
Yeah.
he had like young girls too. Like
Yeah.
12,
Yeah, that's what we're
13.
talking about right now. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Warren.
Yep. Well, yeah.
Warren. Yep. So let's talk about it for a little bit. The reason I bring this up is because the LDS church will look you in the face and disavow the FLDS. And the FLDS themselves would say, we're the true Mormons. We're the true ones, not them. They disobeyed, right? So we talked about, hopefully Casey covered last week, I always mess up his name, Woldruff. No, I can't think of it. It's a WW name, and he was like, yeah, we'll give up polygamy so that we can join the union.
Oh, yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah,
Wilford Woodruff. I always mess it up. I'm like, Wildruff? Wilford Woodruff. He was the one that was essentially like, okay, we're getting rid of polygamy. I'm going to apply again for statehood. He finally got it, and then was able to get the tabernacle and the temples going. So essentially, the FLDS is saying, no. We never should have abandoned polygamy, okay? In 1930, this group was known as the Work, or the Priesthood Work. And in 1942, they changed their name to the United Effort Plan. So 1930, they've been around a long time. It wasn't until 1991, which that's not that long ago, that they adopted the name Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. And their list of church leaders starts out the same as the list that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has. They accept the first three prophets of the church, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and John Taylor, as their leaders. But it's at this point that they actually split apart. Click. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm clicking right. The FLDS do not accept any of the leadership from the time of Wilford Woodruff, the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1889. So from that point on, essentially they're like, nope, we're not with that. Because Wilford Woodruff was the prophet who issued the doctrine that renounced polygamy, which allowed, like I said, Utah to enter into statehood. As a result, all changes to the church since that time are not part of the FLDS belief system. So essentially, from the moment that he said polygamy, they said, nope. Everything before that, yep. Okay? So that's like a little break that you're seeing. So a Christian counterfeit inside of a Christian counterfeit that is now changing things again, different, if that can make sense. So let's see. Where do I want to take this? So the early years of the movement were contentious and saw differing interpretations and opinions among leaders about how plural marriage should actually be practiced. So while they all agreed that plural marriage should stay, they couldn't come to a consensus about how it should be done. And so there was further splits at that point. So these contentions led to what we would call a schism, which created the multiple Mormon fundamentalist organizations that now exist. So we're talking about the FLDS right now, but they're not the only ones that practice polygamy. You also have the Apostolic United Brethren and the Latter-day Church of Christ, also sometimes known as the Kingston Group. It's commonly believed by all of these sects that the early leaders of the fundamentalist movement received revelations from God commanding that plural marriage should not cease. In 1984, a schism formed within the FLDS. So I just said there was ones that were like, okay, we all believe in polygamy, so we're breaking off. Then there was a break inside of the FLDS. So you see what's happening. It's fracturing and getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Just before the death of leader L. Roy S. Johnson, a small group of FLDS took issue with the, quote, one-man rule doctrine that altered the leadership structure of the church, and that was implemented fully when Roland Jeffs assumed his position as the sole leader of the organization. Jeffs, yes. Unlike the Worldwide Mormon Church, which has a president, 12 apostles, several quorums of 70 at its head, the FLDS Church has a powerful single leader. Here is where we have a cult inside of a Christian counterfeit, okay? So they're starting to say, no, I and I alone have the truth. Remember that list of questions and things that I said it might be a cult if, and I think Casey handed you guys out kind of a rubric if you want to see if something might be a cult. One of those things is there an enigmatic singular leader that rises up and basically says, nobody else has gotten it right except for me? You might be in a cult if that's the case. Not saying you for sure are. You might be. Let's see. Breaking from the FLDS, these followers moved just south of Colorado City in Centennial Park, Arizona, calling themselves, quote, the Work of Jesus Christ, or the Work for short. They've been around for most of the 20th century in or around the twin towns of Hilldale and Colorado City on the Utah-Arizona border. And there are about 10,000 members of the FLDS religion. Now, 10,000 members is not small, right? You just heard me say it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That should give you some indication as to exactly how large the LDS church actually is. It is very, very, very large. It's a Christian counterfeit, and inside of it, there are further schisms and further breaks and further people who would say, yeah, kind of, but not really, so we have a different name, and we have different leaders, and we have different authority structures. So while I'm talking about the FLDS, please know that they're not the only one that exists inside of the Latter-day Saints umbrella, if you want to put it that way. So 10,000 members for the FLDS, and they are maybe a hate group, question mark. So according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the FLDS are considered a hate group. The SPLC states on their website that, quote, still actively practicing polygamy more than a century after the mainstream Mormon church abandoned the practice, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a white supremacist, homophobic, anti-government, totalitarian cult. That is a quote from the SPLC, which is the Southern Poverty Law Center.
I think I would discount that because they have actually listed Focus on the Family and several other Christian organizations as hate groups too.
Yes, and
So,
it's not a sole judge, jury, executioner stance on it, but they are white supremacist, they are homophobic, and they are anti-government. So those things are true legally through proceedings that we haven't got to yet, but yes, I agree with you. Because their practice of polygamy seems to take precedence, much less attention has been given to their racist and homophobic beliefs. In 1978, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints actually allowed all males, regardless of race, to hold the priesthood. I mentioned that before, that pre-1978 you couldn't if you were black. FLDS members view this decision as the Mormons' spiritual downfall, and Warren Jeff's sermons have him proclaiming the following, quote, the black race is the people through which the devil has always been able to bring evil unto the earth. Quote, he, Cain, was cursed with a black skin, and he is the father of all the Negro people. He is used by the devil as a mortal man to do great evils. If you young people were to marry a Negro, you could not be a priesthood person. Even if you repented, you could not stay in this work. That is from the FLDS priesthood history class in 1995. Quote again, the people grew so evil, the men started to marry the men, and the women married the women. This is the worst evil act you can do next to murder. It is like murder. Whenever people commit that sin, the Lord destroys them. Warren Jeff's sermon, 2001. Quote, the woman, if she is not careful, will be overbearing and always ask permission for what she wants. And ladies, build up your husbands by being submissive. That's a quote from a Warren Jeff sermon in 2005. So these are just examples that were given to their belief systems and how they could be seen as a hate group. Again, they're anti-women, they're homophobic, and anti-government, and racist as well. So polygamy, the doctrine of the FLDS community center around polygamy as a celestial law, and it appears that the norm to qualify for exaltation is 3 or more wives. So remember with the LDS, I said exaltation is possible, and there was a list of ways you could do it. For the FLDS, it doesn't count until you have 3 wives or more. That is the only time exaltation can be achieved. Let's see. Oh yeah, so the quote church currently practices placement marriage, whereby a young woman of marriageable age is assigned a husband by revelation from God to the leader, who is regarded as a prophet. The prophet elects to take and give wives to and from men according to their worthiness. This is also called the law of placing. So as long as you are considered of marrying age, you don't get to choose who you marry. It is arranged essentially, but it is said that it's from a vision from God to the prophet. So you young lady are to marry this person, even though this person might already have 6 wives. But God told me, so that's it, and that's it. Choice is not really there. Let's see. Just to know, this is a unique law to the FLDS and did not exist in early Mormon polygamous practice. So it's their own unique practice of having plural wives. They live in their own close communities. They have their own unique health issues. So Colorado City Hills area has the world's highest incidence of fumarase deficiency, which is an extremely rare genetic condition. I think I need to, no. Geneticists attribute this to the prevalence of cousin marriage between descendants of the town's founders, Joseph Smith Jessup and John Yates Barlow. It causes encephalopathy, severe mental retardation, unusual facial features, brain malformation, and epileptic seizures. Their standard of dress also differentiates them. Women and girls usually wear monochromatic homemade long-sleeved prairie dresses with hems that reach to the ankle mid-calf, along with stockings or trousers underneath, and their hair is often pulled back and up. So if you've ever seen someone dressed like that, that's FLDS, not LDS, which is why I'm talking about that. They did make national news. Warren Jeffs in 2002 assumed the leadership of the FLDS. Let's see, there was a Winston Blackmore who had been serving in Canada as the Bishop of the Bountiful for the FLDS Church, was excommunicated by Warren Jeffs in a power struggle. And this just led to a huge split. Some people followed Blackmore, some people followed Jeffs. He is known for ruling with an iron fist, outlawed swimming, watching television, and taking excessive control over the practice of spiritual marriage. Jeffs alone would assign wives to husbands, like I said. And when a wife should be reassigned following an alleged deviation by her husband from the path of righteousness. So you could be married the 5th wife of Bob, and if Warren Jeffs thought that Bob was not righteous enough, he could reassign all of Bob's wives to be married to someone else. So women really were not, they were property, basically. Warren could tell them who they were going to go be with, and if that wasn't the case anymore, now you've got to pack it all up, and now you're going to go be this guy's wife. It's really oppressive. It's not great. Let's see. Former members also allege that Jeffs would reduce competition for wives by excommunicating younger male members. The young men were typically thrown out of the cult with no money, and became known as the Lost Boys. And you can see lots of news accounts about these Lost Boys. If you look it up, it's a pretty well-known thing. And then in 2005, the FLDS, under the rule of Warren Jeffs, came under intense scrutiny. That was the year the prophet went on the run after a warrant for his arrest was issued on charges of conspiracy to commit rape and sexual conduct with a minor. During that same period, 8 other FLDS men were arrested on various charges, and a judge decided to freeze $1 million of the group's assets. If you've got $1 million in assets, it's a lot of assets for a cult.
Well, here's is 100 million.
Oh, did I say it wrong? 100 million. Yes, it is 100 million. What did I say out loud?
1 million.
Sorry, no, 100 million. I apologize. No, $1 million. 100 million. I apologize. But while on the run, he managed to organize the transfer of several hundred of those families he deemed most faithful to him to a large compound outside of El Dorado, Texas, where dormitories and an enormous church-like structure were built. Jeffs managed to ascend to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Okay? This is why I'm talking about this, right? You think cults, some obscure thing over here, we don't want to talk about it, it's dark, it's hidden away. No. No. FBI's 10 most wanted. That's huge. I don't know if that hits anybody else as huge as it hits me, but every time I read it, I'm like, What? What? Blows my mind. Became one of the 10 most wanted of the FBI. And he was able to essentially evade capture, but a routine traffic stop in 2006. Got him. And in 2007, he tried to hang himself while he was in prison awaiting trial. A year later, he was sentenced by a Utah judge to 2 consecutive terms of 5 years to life, meaning he has to serve at least 10 years, for marrying a 14-year-old girl to her 19-year-old cousin. In 2008, the group purchased $2 million worth of property in 5 locations along the remote eastern flank of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, about 170 miles southwest of Denver. In April 2008, after what turned out to be a prank phone call from a woman claiming she had been raped, police raided that compound and took 460 children into protective custody. After a ruling determined that the state had in fact overreached by taking those children, all of them were brought back, which is sad to me, a little bit, a lot. Jeff's financial activities are also suspect. The FLDS has grown on the property of its members, many of whom will sign over their wealth to their leader. Additionally, there are allegations that the, quote, spiritually married FLDS women are encouraged to apply for federal benefits designed for single mothers. So they're not legally married, right? Because that's not legal in the United States. And so now you are spiritually married, and in the government's eyes, a single mom, so you can apply and get federal benefits. But you're also a religion, so you get benefits that way too. Let's see. There is some evidence that Warren Jeffs continues to lead the group from prison, but there are also reports that have surfaced of a memo in which he actually renounced his position as their prophet, leaving them leaderless. And there's a lot of documentaries that have been made on this topic. You can watch them. Take them with a grain of salt, because obviously they're Hollywoodized and made entertaining. But A&E, I believe, did a series on lots of different cults and religions, and you can find a lot of these more controversial topics in them. But yeah, so that's where we're going to stop with the LDS. There's lots more, guys. Again, this is not designed to be comprehensive. It's designed to hit the big majors. And I wanted to talk about the FLDS in this class to show you that even inside some of these religions, there are further breakdowns and different groups that emerge that look more cult-ish, right? They don't look as much like an organized religion. You've got some seedy happenings here. Clearly, you don't make the top 10 FBI most wanted list because you're an outstanding citizen. It just doesn't typically happen. So I'll leave that there. Any questions? I know I just kind of routed off a lot of information at you, but okay. Well, let's get going into Christian Science then, and we're going to stick a fork in the LDS. And again, please know my notes, the ones that I have, will be made available to you digitally post this class. Okay, so you'll have those when you are doing your quizzes, things like that. Okay, I forgot to do all my clicks because I just got so focused on what I was doing. I apologize. So Christian Science. Who knows what it is? Who's heard of it before? Anybody? Okay, so not totally unfamiliar then. Great. For some of us it is though. Okay. So here's the thing about this one. What do you see on this page right here? This picture. What is that? That's a girl. We're going to talk about a religion founded by a girl, which Christian counterfeit religion. I'm going to use those kind of interchangeably. Mary Baker Eddy, or Eddie, depending on how you want to say it. I think it's Eddie.
I've seen some churches like that. They're usually really small, like
Mm-hmm.
like storefront.
Yep.
Looking.
Yep. Mm-hmm. You maybe have heard of a Christian Science reading room. There's one in Cocoa Village.
Yeah.
That's where I saw it.
Yep.
That's exactly where I saw it.
Science read. That's
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yep. So that's what we're talking about. So it's not as foreign as you might think. There's a place you can go in Cocoa Village right now. Okay, so the founder, Mary Baker Eddy, born in 1821 and lived until 1910. Pause. Women didn't have the vote until when?
1960.
The vote?
The
1960?
right to vote?
The right to vote was before that, wasn't it?
No, I think it was 1960.
I thought it was 1920.
Somewhere in
Maybe I'm mixing things up.
Yeah.
1960 is not that long
there. It was
ago.
an amendment to the
I know.
Constitution.
Google it. Somebody Google it. Now I'm confused. I'm wanting to trust you, but I felt like it was 1920. While you Google that.
It was.
1920.
Yeah, 1920.
Yeah. So what? That's okay. That's okay. They couldn't get credit cards until 1960. They also couldn't own property until 1960. Think about that for a second. By themselves, without a man. Women. Yeah.
He was telling me, he was telling me that was the downfall when they were actually able to get credit cards.
That was the downfall of what? Society.
Got yourself in that.
This is
It was a joke for the online friends watching right now. It's a joke. It's a joke. My point in saying that is, when was she born? 1821. This is 100 years before women had the vote, and she's out here starting a religion. To me, that says a lot. That a woman would be listened to, would be regarded, that her opinions would matter, and that people would trust this person for religious advice. That just blows my mind. So, let's continue. She was born on July 16th, 1821, near Concord, New Hampshire, as the youngest of 6 children, and she was born to devout Congregationalist parents. If you're not sure what that is, that's a type of Christian, Congregationalist. So her father, Mark Baker, was a farmer and a community leader, and she wrote this about him, that at one point her father had been a justice of the peace and a chaplain of the New Hampshire State Militia. Oh, let me get my cookies. There we go. Her mother, Abigail Ambrose Baker, gave birth to Mary at age 37. This was considered old age in that day. And Mary struggled with illness from the time that she was a child, which they attributed to the fact that her mother gave birth to her so late in her life. She was given to what is, quote, nervous tantrums, unaccountable fevers, and chronic spinal trouble. As a result of her poor health, they kept her out of school most of the time. And rather than attending school in a traditional sense, she was tutored by her older brother who went to Dartmouth. And he would bring his college books home and she would study those. This is a quote. My father was taught to believe that my brain was too large for my body and so kept me out of school. But I gained book knowledge with far less labor than is usually requisite. At 10 years of age, I was familiar with Lindy Murray's grammar, as with the Westminster Catechism, and the latter I had to repeat every Sunday. My favorite studies were natural philosophy, logic, and moral science, and from my brother Albert, I received lessons in the ancient tongues, both Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. This is a quote from Retrospection and Introspection, which is a book by Mary. In 1831, at the age of 10, she was introduced to a handsome older man named George Washington Glover, who told her he would come back later on and marry her. And at the age of 12 is when she began to write. She started writing poetry at that time. And in 1836, the Bakers moved to Sanborn, New Hampshire, the town now known as Tilton, New Hampshire. She was said to be considered beautiful and the belle of the town, and she continued to write poetry, and several of her verses were locally published. So she was gaining some notoriety. People knew her. She was pretty. In 1838, she joined the Sanborn Congregational Church, and December 10th, 1843, Mary Baker and George Washington Glover were married, and on Christmas Day of that year, they moved to North Carolina. So this is clearly a different day where a grown man could come and confess his love for a 10-year-old and say that he would come back and marry her when she was of age, and that's exactly what he did. So that's what I just read to you in case you didn't catch that, which by our standards would be strange, probably. Hopefully, maybe. Let's see. So they were married on Christmas Day and moved to North Carolina. On June 27th, 1844, her new husband died of yellow fever. So she was married for just about a year before he passed away. She was now a widow, and she was 6 months pregnant and was forced to return to her home via train and steamboat. This is where we get into something called the legal doctrine of coverture. And this is foreign to us because we don't live in this day, so I'll explain that to you. Coverture is a legal doctrine by where upon marriage, a woman's legal rights and obligations were absorbed by those of her husband. A married woman was considered a dependent, similar to an underage child or a slave, and could not hold property in her own name, control her own earnings, except under very specific circumstances. And additionally, under this law, when a woman's husband died, she is unable to be the sole legal guardian to their underage children. This would mean that because her husband passed away and she was pregnant, she would not be able to be the legal guardian of her husband's child. So she had to go back home and to her mother and father, essentially, which they then became the legal guardian of the child. So her son, George Washington Jr., also known as Georgie, was born on September 12th, 1844, in her father's home. Her husband's death, the 14,000 mile long journey home, no, 1,400, sorry, misreading my numbers here. And the childbirth left her physically exhausted, and she ended up being bedridden for months. Their domestic servant and nurse looked after Mary, and her infant son was left in the care of a wet nurse, which that was the common practice of the day. When Mary's health returned, her son was brought back to her father's house, but it was their domestic servant and her mother, Abigail, that took care of Georgie. In August of 1848, Mary found herself reacquainting with a childhood friend named John Bartlett. He was a Harvard grad, had a promising future as a lawyer, and in April of 1849, they got engaged to be married. John then left for California to establish a new law practice, leaving Mary and her son where they were with her father. And in November of 1849, her mom died. What I'm getting at here is this is a woman who experiences lots and lots of tragedy. As I read about her life, hopefully you will see that. 3 weeks after the death of her mother, her fiance, John Bartlett, also died. In 1850, her father got remarried, and as a result, Mary and her, quote, difficult son were no longer welcome in the house. So she had to find another family member, because remember, the law of coverture still exists. She had to find another family member to live with, and her son was sent away to live with the family's former domestic servant, who was recently married in a nearby town. So because her sister was unmarried, they couldn't take the child either. So they had to find somebody close enough to the family to take this child in. So it went to a servant, and only because that servant had just gotten married. See what's happening here? So she's losing everybody that she loves. Her mom passes away. She can't keep her own child. This is a very heartbroken woman, okay? It's going to come into play. Let's see. So yes, once Georgie was gone, essentially she had nothing to live for, and so her health began to deteriorate, and her sister that she was living with had to take care of her. Eventually, 1952, she's getting back her health, and she meets a guy named Daniel Patterson, a dentist, who was actually related to her stepmother. And by March of 1853, he proposed marriage, but Mary's initial rejection was on religious grounds, as he was a Baptist. Remember, she was originally a Congregationalist, which, not the same thing, but sort of the same thing. So for religious reasons, though, she was like, no, can't do that. But marriage would mean a home for her and her son. So eventually she accepted. And on June 21st, 1853, sorry, they were married. But he would not allow her difficult son to come live with them. So she gets married to the guy because she thinks it's going to reunite her with her son, but he will not allow her son to come and live with him. So heartbreak again. In 1855, Mary Baker Patterson and her second husband, Daniel, moved to North Groton in the middle of nowhere so that they can be closer to her son, but she still can't live with him. Georgie was now 11 years old, and he was widely disliked and didn't really want to learn. Mary's husband, Daniel, disliked him and did everything possible to keep him away. This is a quote from Mary. My dominant thought in marrying again was to get back my child, but after our marriage, his stepfather was not willing he should have a home with me. A plot was consummated for keeping us apart. The family to whose care he was committed very soon removed to what was then regarded as the far west of Minnesota. After his removal, a letter was read to my little son, informing him that his mother was dead and buried. Without my knowledge, a guardian was appointed him, and I was then informed that my son was lost. Every means within my power was employed to find him, but without success. We never met again until he had reached the age of 34, had a wife and 2 children, and by a strange providence had learned that his mother still lived, and he came to see me in Massachusetts. It's just really sad. As a result, once again, her health deteriorated and she became bedridden, very unhappy. In 1859, Daniel's dentistry practice was failing, and Mary's own sister foreclosed on their home. Later in 1860, Daniel and Mary attempted to start fresh and rented a home in Romney, New Hampshire, but who knows what happened in July of 1861? Civil War, friends. All right, here comes the Civil War. So three months later, news came that Mary's son, 16-year-old Georgie, ran away and joined the Wisconsin infantry. This was the first communication Mary had received from her son in 5 years. Her husband, Daniel Patterson, went to Washington to take charge of the distribution of a fund being raised for Northern sympathizers in the South. He decided to go sightseeing near the battlefield at Bull Run, wandered too close to the Confederate lines, and ended up being a prisoner of war. This poor woman. Do you see what's happening? Her life. It's tragic. In June of 1862, Mary entered Dr. Vail's Hydropathic Institute in Hill, New Hampshire, to gain some relief from her conditions, but the cure was unsuccessful. But while there, she heard about a successful healer in Portland, Maine. And this person's name was Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. Remember his name. He was a traveling mesmerist who believed in what we know today to be human psychology and is generally regarded as the founder of the New Thought movement, a religio-metaphysical healing cult. He believed that the cause and cure of disease was mental, that disease was simply a false belief. He called his method of healing the, quote, science of health and the, quote, science of Christ, and had used the term, quote, Christian Science to describe his work. At that time, she was so frail that she would have to be carried to her hotel room, so she couldn't even walk. Less than 2 weeks later, she was cured, and by all accounts was a brand new person. She stayed with Quimby for 2 months, observing him, discussing his methods, reading his writings, and praising him in the local newspapers. Because remember, she had started writing at an early age, and she had been published multiple times. So it wasn't a big deal for her to write things and people to publish it. So now this is getting put into the newspaper in their area. She would go on to become his disciple for the next 4 years, and the extent to which he influenced her is very heavily debated. In November of 1862, Daniel Patterson was able to escape from prison, return to his wife, and then they moved to Lynn, Massachusetts. Dr. Patterson took up his practice. Mary wrote occasionally for the local paper and became an active member of the Good Templars, a local temperance society. Her health often failed when she was away from Quimby, and she made many trips back to Maine to visit the healer. In 1865, the war ended, and in that same year, her father died. He left her the sum of $1. In January of 1866, sorry, I have to pause. That's a big deal. $1. Sorry.
Back then, though,
I know, but still.
it's not that much.
No. And all accounts that I read was like it was like a slap in the face. Like he left her something, he might as well have left her nothing, was kind of the way it was interpreted. In January of 1866, Phineas P. Quimby died of an abdominal tumor, and he remained convinced to the end of the truth of his mind healing theory. And this is what's called the fall that led to it all. On February 1st, 1866, on her way to a meeting of the Good Templars, Mary fell on some ice and was seriously injured. A homeopathic physician found her injuries to be a concussion and partial spinal dislocation, a life-threatening injury. She was given morphine for pain management. A few days later, a clergyman came to prepare her for the worst, and she asked for her Bible. According to her own account, 3 days later, she opened her Bible to an account of Jesus healing a man quickly and completely, and she was healed spontaneously. When the clergyman returned to check in on her later that same evening, Mary met him at the door, having fully recovered. In an effort to learn how and why, she continued to search the Bible to find the underlying laws of God that would form the basis of her teaching and the practice of Christian Science. This is a quote from her. I then withdrew from society about 3 years to ponder my mission, to search the scriptures, to find the science of mind that should take the things of God and show them to the creature and reveal the great curative principle. This is from her work, Retrospection and Introspection. Years later, the homeopathic doctor that had examined her, Dr. Alvin Cushing, issued an affidavit that called into question the severity of her accident. He testified under oath that he, quote, did not at any time declare or believe that there was no hope for Mrs. Patterson's recovery or that she was in, quote, critical condition. And so this is her works come into question, looking at her as if she's a fraud, and he goes on record saying that, no, I never said it was serious and that she wasn't going to walk again. I never said that. But she says that he said that. So it's a he said, she said situation. In the summer of 1866, Mary and Daniel Patterson separated, and she changed her name back to Mary Glover. And it's good to know as well, she was considered an eccentric for the standards of that day. She was widowed, separated from her husband, unusually attired, and strangely mannered, moving from boarding home to boarding home, and seemed to have become what's known as a spiritualist. Frank Podmore, an English author and founder of what's known as the Fabian Society, known for his psychical research, wrote, quote, but she was never able to stay long in one family. She quarreled with all her hostesses, and her departure from the house was heralded on 2 or 3 occasions by a violent scene. Her friends during these years were generally spiritualists. She seems to have professed herself a spiritualist and to have taken part in seances. She was occasionally entranced and had received, quote, spirit communications from her deceased brother Albert. Her first advertisement as a healer appeared in 1868 in the spiritualist newspaper called The Banner of Light. During these years, she carried about with a copy of one of Quimby's manuscripts, giving an abstract of his philosophy. This manuscript she permitted some of her pupils to copy. So this is from a book written by Frank Podmore called Mesmerism and Christian Science, A Short History of Mental Healing. And that was written in 1909, so not too long after her day. Between 1866 and 1870, Etty boarded at the home of Bryn Payne Clark, who was interested in spiritualism. And according to Cather and Milne, Miss Richard Hazeltine attended seances at Clark's home, and she said that Etty had acted as a trance medium, claiming to channel the spirits of the apostles. And there were also reports of healings wherever she lived. So why do I tell you all of that? Is she started out as a Congregationalist. She then moved to Phineas P. Quimby, who is associated with the New Thought movement and which is often regarded as the beginning of the New Age movement, which is often regarded as a cult, which we will be talking about in subsequent weeks. And then she finds herself involved in spiritualism or spiritism, doing seances, acting as a medium. So you see where I'm going with this, right? Essentially, she's taking herself further and further and further away from Christianity, while at the same time claiming to have opened her Bible and received a miraculous healing that spawned her search for the truth about how to build this religion we're studying called Christian Science. And on that note, we'll take a break.